My stepmother made sure that on my 18th birthday, my father kicked me out to make space for her baby. I refused to leave after discovering they had taken money from my late mother's wealthy family. Hey, I've been having a tough time with my family lately. I just turned 18 last week, and my dad thought it was the perfect moment to throw me out. My mother passed away when I was just 3 in a tragic accident. Since then, my dad has cycled through a series of girlfriends and failed relationships. As a kid, it felt like there was always a woman in our home whenever he was around. I had a nanny to look after me while my dad worked, but he never came home alone. His girlfriend was always with him. After my mother died, he cut ties with her family, claiming he didn't see the point in keeping in touch. I figured they didn't want to be reminded of the tragedy, which is why they never fought for custody to visit me. So it was just me and my dad as I grew up, but he never seemed invested in being a father. He spent most of his time working or with whichever girlfriend he had at the moment. I tried hard to connect with him, but I rarely received love or affection. He only did the bare minimum. I learned to expect nothing from him, and my childhood turned out to be lonely and a bit sad. Fortunately, I had my grandfather, who was my only source of family connection. He would visit occasionally, and I cherished those moments, but he couldn't take me in since my dad refused to give up custody. My father was cold but never outright cruel. I guess my grandfather didn't have enough legal grounds to challenge him. Sometimes I would go to my grandfather's house, but my dad was strict about limiting those visits to only a few days at a time. I never understood why he was so insistent on keeping me close, even if he treated me indifferently. As I grew older, I began to rebel against my dad's rules, wanting to stay at my grandfather's house longer. My grandfather showed me genuine love and care, in stark contrast to my dad's indifference. But whenever I brought this up, my father would simply remind me that he was my dad, and his word was final. My grandfather tried to persuade my dad to treat me better, but nothing ever changed. I was stuck living with my father throughout my teenage years, and our relationship soured even further when he married Veronica, my stepmother. Veronica, the niece of our neighbor, had moved in after her own living situation improved. Almost immediately, she took a dislike to me, and I couldn't fathom why. I had always tried to be friendly, but she seemed to resent my presence as a reminder of my father's previous marriage. Once she began dating my father, my life took a turn for the worse. Veronica made it her mission to make my life miserable whenever we were together. She treated me like a servant, insisting that I take on all the chores, even with a maid in the house, while my dad looked the other way. I felt like Cinderella in my own home. Things only got worse when she convinced my dad to stop giving me money for outings with friends. She insisted I was old enough to get a job and support myself, so I had to find part-time work just to be able to go out, rather than begging my dad for scraps of kindness. Living with them felt unbearable, and I counted the days until I could leave for college and escape. I shared my struggles with my grandfather, hoping he could help me. He promised to talk to my dad, but as time went on, I lost faith that anything would change. My grandfather would listen patiently as I vented, but the situation never improved. By the time my birthday rolled around, I just wanted to celebrate turning 18 with my friends. I'd saved up for weeks to buy some beers and have a good time, but then my dad and Veronica dropped a bombshell to ruin my day. On the morning of my birthday, they called me in for a serious discussion. I almost thought they might surprise me with good news or maybe even offer to help with college. Instead, they told me I had to leave the house. Veronica had found out she was pregnant a few weeks earlier, and they needed my room for the baby. My dad claimed they had thought it over carefully and that I shouldn't beg or act desperate, as that would ruin their good vibes. Veronica pretended to be concerned, saying that since I was an adult now, it was time for me to fend for myself and this could be the start of something new. All I heard was a sneaky plan to get rid of me. Trying to stay calm, I reminded them that they couldn't legally evict me without proper notice and that they needed to wait a few months until I could find somewhere else to live. I honestly wasn't sure what the legalities were, but I thought there had to be some law protecting me from being evicted like this. My dad, however, wasn't swayed by my claims. He told me he had already consulted with a lawyer and doubted I had the resources or money to fight him on it, which was true. I didn't have either. In a last-ditch effort, I suggested I could pay rent while I stayed there. Veronica immediately shot that down, insisting it wasn't about money. She simply didn't want to deal with me while she was pregnant, claiming she needed a peaceful environment. Desperate, I asked my dad if I could at least move to the basement, but he still refused. Given that he worked at a bank and had a decent income, enough that Veronica had quit her job to be a stay-at-home wife, I knew finances weren't the issue. After some fruitless arguing, it became clear they were determined to get rid of me. Now that I was an adult, they could kick me out without any legal consequences, and I was powerless to stop them. Defeated, I headed to my room to pack my things. I had no idea if my grandfather would take me in. He wasn't financially stable. He had been a high school science teacher but was now retired. Years of a gambling addiction had devastated his savings, and he relied heavily on my dad for support. I doubted he could afford to take me in, which was why I hadn't moved in with him sooner. To be fair, my grandfather lived modestly, and I could adjust to that. I didn't want to burden him further, but I had no choice. So, without overthinking it, I went to my grandfather's house and explained what my father had said. I had been dreading this moment for over a year, but deep down, I knew it would come. On top of that, I was anxious about how I would pay for college, which was only a couple of months away. The weight of it all overwhelmed me, and I found myself in tears. That's when my grandfather declared he'd had enough and that it was time to do what he should have done years ago. I was confused and didn't know what he meant, but he stepped into another room to make a phone call. I tried to eavesdrop but could barely catch any words, so I gave up. After what felt like an eternity, my grandfather emerged and told me not to worry. I could live with him now, and I wouldn't have to stress about college. I was taken aback and wanted to know what had happened, but he seemed upset and insisted it wasn't my business at the moment. Instead, he encouraged me to go out and celebrate my birthday with friends because I deserved to enjoy my day without moping around. With my immediate problems seemingly resolved, I decided to make the most of it. I kept my phone on silent that evening, not wanting my dad to ruin my night after he had already spoiled the day. It wasn't until I returned to my grandfather's house, close to 10 p.m., that I discovered my dad had been texting and calling. It was strange. He seemed to have suddenly developed a conscience and was pleading for me to come back. I didn't respond right away, waiting until the next morning to inform him that I wouldn't be returning. I was honest, telling him I couldn't come back after how he had treated me and because I finally had a chance to be happy. The thought of living with him and Veronica again was unbearable. He had controlled me for so long, but now I was an adult who could choose where to live. He had no right to ask me to come back after kicking me out. After sending that message, my dad replied with a lengthy text that was surprisingly heartfelt. He reflected on his actions, mentioning he had come across an old photo album that reminded him of the promises he made to my mother. He felt he was letting her down by prioritizing Veronica and the baby over me and wanted one last chance to be a better father. The news of the pregnancy had shocked him, leading him to comply with Veronica without thinking it through. Now, he regretted kicking me out and wanted me back in his life. I chose not to respond, sensing manipulation in his words. I didn't understand what he hoped to gain from this change of heart, and a week later, he continued to text me daily, reminiscing about good memories and apologizing for his past behavior. I initially thought he was trying to manipulate me, but now I was unsure. I spoke with my grandfather about it, but he urged me not to fall for my dad's act, expressing his disapproval of my father's sudden niceness. I felt conflicted. My dad's efforts to be better tugged at my heart, yet I didn't want to return. Part of me felt guilty, as if I were betraying him, while the rational side insisted that prioritizing my well-being was the right choice. My father texted that he would even beg on his knees for my return if that's what it took. I felt pity for him, yet I still couldn't bring myself to reply, and guilt lingered in my chest. So, am I a jerk for not wanting to go back to my father's house even though he's pleading for me to return? Update: I've decided I'm not going back to my dad's house, and I'm beginning to doubt he meant any of what he said. I recently discovered that my dad's desperate pleas for me to come back had little to do with our relationship and everything to do with his own lifestyle and maintaining it. I sat my grandfather down to discuss my father's incessant begging and my guilt about not wanting to return. I had tried to talk to him about this before, but he had always insisted I shouldn't fall for my dad's manipulative tactics. This time, I needed to get it all off my chest, even if my grandfather couldn't offer much help. After listening to me, my grandfather grew serious. He told me he had kept something important from me that he felt I needed to know. He revealed that since I was a child, my dad hadn't been financially responsible for my upbringing. Instead, it had been my mother's family providing the funds. Ever since I was kicked out, my grandfather had contacted them to explain how my dad was treating me. They were furious with him for allowing this situation to continue for so long without speaking up. and they insisted that I must live with my grandfather from now on. My dad was completely unaware of this arrangement until just a few days ago when my grandfather finally told him. My grandfather had been the liaison between my mother's family and my dad, passing along the financial support they sent. Dad had always assumed my grandfather was the one providing for me, and my grandfather had never corrected him. He feared that my dad wouldn't accept help from my mother's side, which could have put me at risk, so he kept quiet. The truth explained a lot, like why I had attended private school, something my dad would never have chosen to pay for. Unfortunately, after marrying Veronica, my dad had started withholding those funds from me, forcing me to get a job just to afford the basics like clothes and outings. I wasn't deprived of food, but it still felt awful. My grandfather hadn't told my mother's family about my treatment because he feared they might take me away if they intervened, which would mean losing me entirely. After I was kicked out, he finally decided he had to speak out for my sake and revealed the truth. I was frustrated with him for not coming forward sooner, but he explained that it was a secret my mother's family insisted on keeping. They didn't want me to know about their financial support because they worried it might compel me to seek a relationship with them, which they weren't ready for, not because they disliked me, but because I resembled my mother too closely for them to cope emotionally. We talked things through, and while I still had a lot to process, I felt more grounded knowing the truth. I was determined not to fall for my dad's manipulation anymore. It was clear he only wanted me back for the money. I had sensed that his newfound kindness was too good to be true, and now I felt validated in my decision. Update 2. I decided to block my father after learning the truth about his motives for wanting me back. A couple of days later, he started contacting me using Veronica's number. She even called me to express how horrible I was being to my dad. I didn't have her number saved, so I answered, but as soon as I recognized her voice, I wanted to hang up. Curiosity got the better of me, though, and I stayed on the line while she feigned tears, saying my dad was really upset and she couldn't bear to see him like this, especially given her condition. I told her I wasn't interested in speaking to her, and she handed the phone over to my dad. Before he could say anything, I cut him off, telling him I was aware of the truth and wouldn't fall for his act anymore. He pretended not to know what I was talking about, so I suggested that perhaps my mother's family could explain it better and then hung up. I also blocked Veronica's number, feeling a surge of satisfaction at having taken a stand. In more positive news, I spoke to my grandfather about wanting to meet my mother's family. Despite their hesitations, he managed to convince them to fly down and meet me for the first time. I had seen pictures of my maternal grandparents and uncle, but I knew meeting them in person would be a different experience. The anticipation was a little nerve-wracking, but I felt hopeful knowing they had supported me all along. Update 3. I just got back from my first meeting with my mother's family, and it went incredibly well. My grandfather was with me, which helped ease my nerves. My other grandparents were wonderful, and my uncle was like an older version of me. We all teared up when we first saw each other, which made for an awkward moment for the other patrons at the restaurant, but we didn't care. We were just so happy to finally connect. After the emotional greetings, they asked me about my life and interests. They genuinely seemed interested and cared about me, which was a refreshing change. They assured me I didn't need to worry about my college fund. They had it all sorted out. I had forgotten to mention my concerns to my grandfather, so this was a huge relief. We had a fantastic time together, and we've already planned to meet a few more times before they head back home next week. They promised to visit every month, either having me fly out to them or coming to see me. I'm genuinely thrilled about it and looking forward to building a relationship with them.